I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. We can leave the poll question up for a little bit. That's okay. I think a couple more people will come in the next few minutes. So far, we have 41% saying yes and 50% saying no. We just got up, so we're even. That's great. We will be giving you the link at the end of this webinar so that for those who are voting no, you can click on that link and explore the resources of both of our learning groups. And that's where the recordings of all of our webinars live as well. So if there's a past webinar you might want to catch up with, that's where you'll find it. You want to go ahead and advance the slides, please. In this presentation, like I mentioned earlier, is really the first time that we've had a presenter who talks to us about questions in our learning, both of our learning groups. And so today we're going to hear a little bit more about the Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network and a couple of case studies that, if you go ahead and go to the next slide, please, you'll see how it answers questions that we identified in both of our learning agendas. So learning agendas help you articulate your theory of change, which we've done for both conservation enterprises and then for multiple strategic approaches for combating wildlife trafficking. And it really helped us focus in and identify the learning questions and then how we were going to answer those questions through our activities. So if we look at the next slide, please, you'll see some of the questions that we're going to focus on today. This is the conservation enterprise theory of change and our key learning questions. I think what the question we're going to really zero in on today here is about benefits. So that number 2 in the middle, do the enterprises lead to benefits for stakeholders? And then if we go to the next slide, please. This is a summarized version of our combating wildlife trafficking theory of change. And if you zero in on the questions there with another click, this is really where we're going to talk about for wildlife trafficking, about incentive structures for communities to participate in counter wildlife trafficking issues, and also approaches that establish cooperation with communities. If you go ahead to the next slide, I think it's just another way of explaining what those questions are. What's the best practice for community engagement in wildlife crime? And some examples for collaboration. You go ahead to the next slide. I am really excited, as we talked about with Judy earlier too in the chat, to have Judy join us here today. She's been in wildlife conservation and human-wildlife conflict for over 20 years and is the founder, or co-founder rather, of the Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network and the Certified Wildlife Friendly trademark. The Wildlife Friendly Network works with the private sector partners in both the food, health and beauty, textile, and tourism sectors. The network works to improve outcomes in raw material sourcing that benefit people and wildlife around the world. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Julie, and thank you so much again for joining us. There's been a lot of excitement about your presentation, and I know that we're going to have lots of questions at the end. I did want to note that we are recording this webinar, and we will post it on our learning group site. So without further ado, over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. We're really happy for this opportunity. So I'm going to jump right in. I have to move through my slides fairly quickly. At Wildlife Friendly, we believe we can empower communities, companies, and their consumers to be catalysts for change on the ground. And we do this through the certification of enterprises. But our approach is a little bit different than other certifications you may be familiar with, because we use certification as a tool to get conservation work done. And our standards, which you should have some links to here, and the certification process keep us focused on biodiversity conservation goals. And our pre-assessment process, which you also have links to, helps us to identify those enabling conditions, the key threats, and the presence of key species. We require written agreements with communities to show they understand what a wildlife-friendly conservation enterprise is. And our model is to work with an NGO or researcher on the ground who's monitoring wildlife, and we work closely with those people as trusted partners and they have the connection to the local community, the local government, and other stakeholders. And as you all have pointed out, this implementing partner role does evolve over time as the enterprise matures and grows. Next. So our certified products range from raw materials to finished end products and also to services like tourism. Next. I know I don't have to point this out to this audience, but the people behind the products are just as important as the wildlife because, of course, they hold the future of wildlife in their hands and are taking all the risks by living near wildlife. They're also making the important natural resource decisions every day, which is a really important part of the, which is impacting habitat and wildlife as well as their future living in that landscape. And many of those involved in harvesting and production are women, who we know from the UN, FAO, and others are a really important part of the larger strategy for poverty alleviation and reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. Also, many of the families employed by wildlife-friendly conservation enterprises are the same communities who would otherwise be poachers if they were not employed in legal conservation enterprise. So we see ourselves as an incentive and the carrot for a legal, non-consumptive, wildlife-based economy. Many of these enterprises have been in existence now for over a decade, so longer than the average funding cycle, which, as we know, is really important for consistency and establishing independence from outside donors and funders over time. So this was part of our mission from the beginning. Of course, as we all know, none of this is easy. It's hard work, it takes commitment, and it also requires trust and collaboration. But this, in essence, is how we define conservation enterprise. Next. So I was asked to think about some challenges and opportunities, which is always a great exercise. And I see both agriculture and consumerism as immense challenges and immense opportunities. So I wanted to flag both of these up front so you could be thinking about them throughout the presentation and also in your own work. So in agriculture, we're finding there's a growing awareness of domestic animal welfare on farms, and this is fantastic. It's becoming a lot more mainstream, and companies and consumers are thinking about these issues. But wildlife are still often the invisible collateral damage living just on the other side of the fence or sometimes inside the fence on farms. And wildlife are commonly seen as pests rather than part of a holistic, healthy, functioning farm and ecosystem. But of course, wildlife are proxies for our own health, as we know this week in particular. And farms are the last frontier for the world's wildlife as habitat left outside of protected areas. As far as consumerism, I think we all know the threats posed by consumerism, so I'm not going to go into those in this presentation in the interest of time. But I have some slides at the end of the presentation looking at what I feel is a huge opportunity and sort of helping flesh out our target audience for wildlife-friendly enterprise, or who I think the target audience is. Next. A little bit about our model for catalyzing change. We sit squarely at the intersection of business and biodiversity, and our work is to connect supply and demand in order to spread best practices for people and wildlife and the landscapes that they both depend on for survival. Key threats to wildlife have to be addressed through the conservation enterprise, and in this way, agriculture and consumerism ideally become linked and can move from a threat to an opportunity. And we work to spread awareness through education and storytelling about the impacts of agriculture and other types of production on wildlife for global brands and consumers. So we act as kind of a liaison between the field, the communities, the wildlife, the conservation science, and the brands and their consumers. Next. And of course, as you all know, another way to conceptualize this is using a theory of change. This is a draft. This is a work in progress. We actually just went through this exercise for the first time a few weeks ago, and then were contacted and invited to do this presentation and think about it even more. So this has been a great learning exercise, and we're going to continue refining this. When you have a chance to look at it more closely, you'll see I incorporated some of your language into this draft to start to show some of those parallels and to help us think through this model. But I believe as we continue to refine this, it'll start to look a lot more like yours. Next. So turning back to agriculture, I wanted to look at what we mean by wildlife-friendly agriculture, sourcing and supply chains exactly. And when I boil it down, it comes down to three primary principles in most cases, and those are patchy, permeable, and predator-friendly. So we'll start with patchy. Patchy is the opposite of a monoculture. We have human development fragmenting habitat for wildlife, and if those patches become too small, they no longer function as habitat. So with climate change and the other cumulative threats, we want agricultural lands to be able to serve as habitat and travel corridors. This is a jaguar-friendly coffee farm that sits between two protected areas between Costa Rica and Panama. And our partners at ProCat have identified 18 jaguars by camera trap who are moving through these coffee farms because they're interplanted with native tree species, and it's a shade-grown farm. So this coffee farm is very much serving as a corridor and as habitat, allowing jaguars to move between two national boundaries and protected areas. So we want farms to enable wildlife, from pollinators to apex predators like jaguars, to have habitat stepping stones to travel and make a living there. And we don't like hard edges. We want to blur the edges between agricultural lands and wild lands so that we have wild farms in wild places. Next. We also want agricultural lands to be permeable, so those blurred edges are important. We know that linear features like roads, railroad lines, and impermeable fencing are threats to wildlife and a cause of mortality. These are rheas in Argentine Patagonia. They're trapped inside this fence line. And even when adults of a species which can jump the fences, in this landscape it would be adult guanacos, their young may become tangled and trapped. So fencing is a barrier to ancient migration patterns. It can block access to water or grasslands critical to wildlife, especially as temperatures increase and water resources dry up. Across our learning network, our farmers and ranchers are working on different innovations to improve fencing and make it more wildlife friendly to allow permeability so animals can move to find food, water, and shelter. Next. And predator friendly is really one of our founding core principles. Apex predators, we believe, are proxies for the health of the rest of the ecosystem, impacting everything down the food chain, and providing healthy habitat for wide-ranging wildlife like apex predators also provides ecosystem services for humans that are critical to our existence and well-being. So we really see this as one of the non-cash benefits that wildlife-friendly agriculture can bring to communities and to the world globally. Next. What tools do you use to be a predator-friendly farmer? In some cases, cute ones. So our farmers are using high-tech new innovations and also ancient low-tech tools like these extremely effective livestock guard dogs. These dogs happen to be protecting their cashmere goats on a wildlife-friendly farm in Italy as wolves expand back into historical range across Europe. Next. So I'm going to walk through a few case studies. The first are here. We have two ways that we work, and I'm not going to go into those in great detail since we have limited time, but the next few examples are going to focus on our species-specific work and those related standards. You have links to some of these standards as well. So this is gorilla-friendly, elephant-friendly, sea turtle-friendly, and jaguar-friendly. I just mentioned on the earlier slide, I'm not going to go into here, but just wanted to mention it in this context. So where warranted for the species and when funding has allowed, we work together with global experts and using the best available science to identify threats and survival requirements for a particular species, supply chain, sector, and landscape to develop standards. This model really began with certified gorilla friendly, and since we started working on that with partners, it's inspired several other of these species-specific spin-offs. Next, please. So Gorilla Friendly, it's a partnership with the International Gorilla Conservation Program, which is the coalition of Conservation International, Flora and Fauna International, and World Wildlife Fund. We started this partnership with IGCP in 2012, and it has resulted in two distinct but related certification programs. One is for mountain gorilla tourism in the 4 national parks and 3 range countries for mountain gorillas, and one is for park edge products, which are produced by the farmers living at the park edges of those 4 parks. This has been a multi-year stakeholder consultation process beginning in 2012. We did a business plan in 2016. We've done scoping audits for the park edge products, starting with Bwindi in 2019. And this year we had training modules for park rangers tested in Uganda and Rwanda. Next, please. We also had an illustrated guide for the park edge products produced by a local Ugandan artist, which has been used for sensitization with the local communities around Bwindi to date. And these products cover things like honey and beekeeping, handicrafts, cultural performances, and nature experiences and bird watching. Next. One of the other links you have is to gorillafriendly.org, which is a website that's serving to do education and awareness around best practice for tourists ahead of their mountain gorilla trek. And then post-trek, they can input a confidential evaluation where they share feedback about how well best practice was adhered to by other tourists, guides, etc. during their visit with mountain gorillas. Next. We have a big year planned ahead for Gorilla Friendly, so stay tuned. This is going to be the beginning of our more public-facing work for this effort, so we're really excited, and we look forward to sharing that at some point in the future with you all. Next. And then another case study, certified elephant-friendly tea from India. This is a partnership with the University of Montana. A little historical and ecological context. In the 1800s, the tea plantations were established in the Asian elephant regions by the British. That habitat is now highly fragmented, and elephants need to move through tea lands between fragments of forest to meet their needs for survival. And of course, increased human activity means increased human-elephant conflict. You have a link to these standards as well, so you can have a look, but the key threats that have been identified on tea plantations include electrocutions by improperly installed electric fencing, irrigation ditches, which are a cause of mortality for baby elephants who fall into them and drown, poisoning from improper chemical storage, and as I mentioned, human-elephant conflict. We're scaling this project for impact now. We're doing tea producer outreach and training via our partners at University of Montana and partners in India. We've certified 3 farms to date with more in process. We're happy to report there's very high interest and demand from the tea industry, from retailers, and from consumers in this project. We're also doing ongoing research and monitoring of impacts and community engagement and human-elephant conflict reduction with the University of Montana and our on-the-ground partners in India. Next. And the last species-specific case study is sea turtle-friendly tourism. So we just certified the first sea turtle-friendly resort in the world after several years of working to draft, refine, and pilot these standards, which you also should have a link to. And that resort is 10 Knots Development, also known as El Nido. It's located in the biodiversity hotspot of Palawan in the Philippines. And these standards were developed with expert input from sea turtle conservation practitioners around the world, including the wider Caribbean Sea Turtle Conservation Network, or WIDECAST. And these standards include scalable solutions to address marine wildlife-related threats linked to the tourism industry globally, which can be applied to resorts, tour operators, lodges, and community-based programs. And they include things like long-term monitoring, beachfront lighting, nesting beach management, reef, mangrove, and seagrass protection, responsible wildlife interactions, and engagement with local communities and economies. Next. And I wanted to include one of our non-species specific projects. So this is a project developed under our global certification criteria. And it's, I thought, an interesting example of how sometimes these conservation enterprises can take on a life of their own. And it really represents what I believe is one version of our vision for success. So how do you create a wildlife-friendly fiber shed? We've certified wildlife-friendly merino wool from a World Heritage Site on Peninsula Valdez in Patagonia, Argentina, which is home to thriving populations of marine and terrestrial wildlife. And we've also certified wildlife-friendly mohair and cashmere from transhuman herders. And we're also have been looking for the past few years with the Wildlife Conservation Society at the possibility of ethical, high welfare, live sheared guanaco fiber from Argentina. So the geography, demography, and variety of fibers from this landscape are all growing. On Peninsula Valdez, where we have the 6 certified merino wool farms, that's 32,000 hectares under wildlife-friendly management. And that wool has attracted the attention of several top designers in Buenos Aires who are now sourcing the merino as well as the mohair, and they have interest in the guanaco fiber if that comes online as well. And one of these designers launched her wildlife-friendly line at Paris Fashion Week last year, and was there again this year showcasing her wildlife-friendly fibers. She sells globally, including boutiques in Japan, where we've just had wildlife-friendly point-of-sale materials translated into Japanese for consumers there. And then domestically from her base in Buenos Aires, she's become a bit of a wildlife-friendly fiber ambassador by representing the importance of these fibers to the local economy with government and private sector parties. She's helping to keep alive a local fiber processing sector, which has been dying out in the midst of economic and political instability in Argentina. And her work on this has sparked the interest of other designers in Buenos Aires and beyond who want to source the fiber and tell the wildlife-friendly story. This, in turn, has created business opportunities for other people to help market and sell the fibers. So this wildlife-friendly fibers hub has really taken on a life of its own, and we can sort of start to step back a little bit. And so we consider this sort of a case study of some of the non-cash but also cash benefits that can result once momentum starts to happen. Next, please. So as I mentioned, I wanted to come back to consumerism, that threat and opportunity. Here we're going to look at some of the opportunities. And as a smart person once told me, more people shop than vote. So that's important for us to remember. As global consumers, we can vote with our wallets for change. And since at Wildlife Friendly, we are a consumer-facing family of conservation enterprise brands, I try to keep an eye on research and insights on global consumer trends. One of the firms that I watch, whose work I watch, is called BBMG. We can't afford to hire them. They're expensive, but luckily they provide some of their research and insights for free. And so the next few slides are borrowed from their website and publicly available reports, and I thought it might be of interest to share. So BBMG has defined what they call aspirational consumers. These are consumers who are interested in the stories behind products, and they sit at this important intersection that you see on this slide. They share things that they love with their friends and family. They buy a lot, and they care about sustainability. And these aspirationals are represented across every age, culture, geography, and income. They are, I believe, in essence, wildlife-friendly conservation enterprise influencers in the making. Next, please. And the good news is they now make up 40% of global consumers. If you add that to the 22% you see here of the harder core, what they define as advocate consumers, which in the US we might call crunchy granola tree huggers, who don't buy as much but are very focused on issues, environmental issues, that's over 60% of the world's consumers. So this is a huge opportunity. More than any other segment, these aspirationals are defined by their love of shopping, their desire for responsible consumption, and their trust in brands to act in the best interest of society. So as the largest consumer segment globally, they matter because they're the first to unite materialism, sustainability values, and cultural influence, making them what I believe is an essential and primary target audience for wildlife-friendly conservation enterprises, so that we can build markets, influence cultural norms, and shape behavior at scale. Next, please. So the key takeaway from this slide may or may not come as a surprise to you. Aspirationals are actually strongest in emerging markets, where they make up half or more of the population, including places like Nigeria, India, China, South Africa, Indonesia, Ghana, and Peru. And even though the developed market world is lagging behind a little bit, they still represent 1/3 of consumers in markets like Canada, Russia, the United Kingdom, Greece, Spain, and the US. In emerging markets, aspirationals tend to be millennials, while in developed markets, they're more likely to be Generation X, according to BBMG. Next, please. So this is just interesting, the difference between aspirational and advocates, the messaging from brands. If you look on the left side of the slide, that's messaging for aspirational consumers, and on the right is messaging from brands to advocate consumers. Aspirationals are more likely to respond to an invitation to stand for something positive, to embody the change they want to see in the world, while advocates identify with brands who they see as fighting the good fight against the issues that motivate them and inform their purchasing decisions. Aspirationals match advocates in the belief that we need to consume less to preserve the environment for future generations, but aspirationals are motivated by a sense of idealism and a desire to make a positive impact with their purchases. Aspirationals are also ambassadors for the brands they admire, and they encourage others to buy from socially and environmentally responsible companies. And yet, more than any other segment, they feel guilty when they're not living up to their own expectations. So 75% of aspirationals say, I feel guilty about my negative impact on the environment. They're defined by an innate sense of optimism and a belief that their actions can make a difference. And this sense of optimism includes the belief that they can influence corporate behavior, with 80% of aspirationals saying, as a consumer, I can make a difference in how a company behaves. Next, please. So on the right side of the slide, what are their top issues? 91% of aspirational consumers rank pollution and the environment as the most serious problem facing the world today. 70% believe that companies must play a role in addressing environmental concerns, saying that companies should be held responsible for ensuring their products and operations do not harm the environment. And they're looking to join forces with brands to be more responsible stewards of the planet together. And then on the right, that little quote in red, it says, BBMG says, it's no longer about asking consumers to buy something, it's about inspiring them to be something by helping reveal our best selves and realize a better world. So again, more people shop than vote. Consumerism is perhaps the biggest threat, and as such is also the biggest opportunity if we can harness its power for good. So my challenge and question back to you is, how do we as a conservation community looking to decrease illegal wildlife crime and increase impact from conservation enterprises leverage this opportunity, as well as the opportunity presented by sustainable agriculture globally? And next. So I was asked to come back to you all's theory of change and relate it to our work a little bit. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, our certification process is really about evaluating the enabling conditions and making sure there is the strong link and focus on biodiversity conservation. So I would invite you to, when you have time, look at some of those links, and of course feel free to email me after you've had a chance to digest those. I'm happy to engage in conversation about any of the things you see that you want more information on or have questions on. And in terms of the benefits, I think that fiber shed example in Patagonia did illustrate some of them, but there are many others. So I made just a short list that I can run down. I think one of the benefits that has always been part of our mission and vision from the beginning was, by being wildlife friendly, you're part of a global community of learning. And so we do our best. We're a small organization, but we do our best to share lessons throughout the network. So there might be somebody that's trying an innovation in one part of the world for one species that we feel has relevance somewhere else, and we're always looking to make those connections and connect the dots. We hope that our trust mark is giving access to new markets, new consumer segments for enterprises, and we are seeing that starting to happen. We're having more young entrepreneurs contact us before they even form their business, saying they want to form a business around the principles of wildlife friendly from the beginning and asking us for help with that. So that's really exciting. Again, the sharing of solutions and innovations, particularly for human-wildlife conflict. Many of our enterprises are investing back into infrastructure improvements on the ground where they're working. This can include, for healthcare, education of children, investment in anti-poaching rangers and patrols, which of course is again linked back to illegal wildlife trade and poaching. We often get people inquiring about how they can contribute directly to the field projects. So we often, act as a pass-through for small grants for donors that want to support specific species issues. In the past, we've been able to help some of the field enterprises purchase camera traps, livestock guard dogs, gain organic certification, and things like of that nature. The standards themselves have been a benefit. I think we've been able to take publications by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and others that were sitting on people's desks and then take that information, put them into standards and really operationalize that and get it out into the field. That's what happened with the Certified Gorilla-Friendly Tourism Standards. It was based on a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funded publication. And then from those standards, we can develop educational materials for consumers and tourists and training materials for rangers and park staff. For cash benefits, I did want to speak to that directly. I often get asked if there's a premium and what the premium is for wildlife-friendly products. This is a difficult question to answer. First of all, a premium doesn't always come in the form of an increase per unit sold of something. So it's a complex topic. It's also difficult to determine when a premium, isolate out what the wildlife-friendly bump is if there's a premium for that product. So the product has to be high quality and attractive for consumers in the first place. The product may also have other labels on it. So it's, how do you isolate out the wildlife-friendly aspect of it? However, so I always caution people against promising this or expecting it. But sometimes that premium comes via access to new markets, as I mentioned. Sometimes it comes in consumer loyalty to that brand over time. All that being said, though, we do have some enterprises who are beginning to report price premiums that they believe are related to wildlife friendly alone. So I'm cautiously optimistic on that front. And we also believe there is a link between benefits and behavior change. But as one rancher told me, compensation does not equal reconciliation. So it often takes more than money. Money is always welcome, but it takes more than that. So my vision for success is what do these communities and people in the field, farmers and ranchers, do when no one is looking as a result of our program? And that takes both trust and respect earned over time. So ranchers may never love wolves, but if they believe in our work together and our relationship is based on trust and respect, I believe, and I've seen it in my work over the last 20 years, that leads to real behavior change. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Julie. Gosh, I so enjoyed listening to your presentation. I saw it beforehand as we were clicking through it and preparing for this webinar, but it was just so nice to hear you talk through it. Your comment about more people shop than vote really, really resonated for me. And I also really liked the point that you were making there at the end about trust and respect and what community members do when nobody's watching. I did want to open up in our Q&A box for all of our participants to please, if you have questions, I have several for Julie teed up, but please do drop those questions in the Q&A box and we will moderate them. I guess the first question I had for you, Julie, was, we work a lot with private sector engagement here at USAID. It's a huge priority. We have a new private sector engagement strategy. I guess, what kind of tips can you offer us in how to work effectively and be this bridge? You're very much what we call an intermediary organization, and we're interested in how can we support more in our programs, that link between local communities and the private sector. So that's kind of a two-part question for you. Kind of what are your overall tips of working with private sector, and how to build and scale your work? I guess those are 2 points that I'm interested in.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That has evolved over time as a really important part of what we do, and I don't know if we anticipated that from the beginning. As you mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders, so I was there at our very first meeting, and I don't think we envisioned that was going to be as big a piece of this work as it has turned out to be. Um, so just on a lighter note, one of my friends who is at one of the big brands that we have worked with said to me that she has frustration in working with NGOs. You know, she's a friend, so she's speaking frankly with me. And one of her frustrations is that she said she wants a response yesterday when she asked the question, but she never wants anybody to expect her to answer promptly when people in the field are communicating with her. So it's very much they're two different worlds, and they don't speak the same language. And so part of it is managing expectations. It's very much a two-way learning highway between corporate brands and the private sector and the NGO field people and communities. And as we know, I think some of the challenges for the field people who are working with the local communities day in and day out is that if you raise expectations with the community about purchases, about pricing, all kinds of things, and you're asking them to change their practices, and then for some reason global fashion trends change and that particular raw material is not going to be sourced anymore, you're still left there in the field working with that community, having to explain, why you asked them to do all these different management scenarios, and the benefits aren't flowing. So that's a very real problem, and I think challenge. And so we try to manage those expectations in both directions. On the other side of the supply chain, the brands, the private sector expects responses, quick response time. They usually want things yesterday. They, natural disasters and spotty internet connectivity and things like that, they don't often have patience for that. So they're under a different set of pressures. And so managing those expectations in both directions, when is the harvest season? What happens if there is no harvest that season? What happens if that material is no longer trendy? And so it's actually quite difficult to connect the dots and have a successful supply chain work. But it's important work, and so those are, I guess, some of the challenges that we try to manage in both directions.
And can you think a little bit about your own internal challenges? As I know you're a small NGO running this very worldwide network for conservation. Kind of, if you were trying to go to scale, kind of what different strategies have you considered in terms of your own management? Because I think you have a great deal of responsibility to not be seen as greenwashing, right? I mean, you have responsibility to make sure that wildlife friendly really means wildlife friendly, which must provide you with a lot of challenges. So I just was wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Yes, that's a great question. The brands, obviously, the private sector is always focused on risk management, and so are we. And so one of the things that we've been talking about over the years, we are a certification body, and at first, when we started this work 10 years ago, everybody talked about third-party certification as sort of the gold standard. And being small and working with very, community-based enterprises that didn't have a lot of money and couldn't necessarily afford a $10,000 audit, we were trying to be creative and not let the perfect get in the way of the good. So we considered ourselves from the beginning to be a strong second-party certification, and the certification process is very interactive. So we have some questions that we ask. We often do the applications live by Skype or Zoom, and ask a lot of questions and triangulate as best we can. When we can do a third-party audit and it's affordable, we do that, and we leave open the question of being able to do surprise audits. But in the last few years, what we've really come around to is that our model of working with a trusted NGO partner on the ground is better actually than a third-party audit in a lot of ways, because as I've traveled around the world visiting different farms who are getting audited by third-party auditors, you hear how those audits work, and if you know in advance that an audit's going to happen, you prepare for it. We have people there 365 days of the year watching what's happening on the ground, not somebody that's dropping in for one day a year. So we feel more confident actually in our system. That's not to say that things don't happen, but we've actually had people contact us, our enterprises contact us and say, we're no longer able to meet the standards. We're giving you a heads up, and we're voluntarily withdrawing from the program. So for us, that's another example of a success story, because again, it comes down to those trusted relationships, and we value, those are worth more than gold. It's not a perfect system, nothing is, but so far that's the way we've decided to proceed, and we really consider it a family. Of course, as your family gets larger, it's harder to maintain those things. So it's a delicate balance, I think, of growing and being able to manage that risk and feel that we're confident that what people say is happening. But that's where the trust and respect and the long-term relationships, I think, are super, super important.
Well, thanks for that. I think you've answered a couple of questions that we were getting in our Q&A box. Please do keep them coming. Kashmira was wondering about your work, which I'm assuming is in Assam for the elephant-friendly tea. She had seen work by Sustainable Agriculture Network and Rainforest Alliance not really work. So I think she was eager to hear a bit more about that work. We had another question about, are all of your, it looks like all of your certified wildlife friendly are species based, and because I think you're very site based, and so he was Nathan in Mozambique was wondering if you have any broader certifications that are more like habitat focused. And then Natalie also wondered if you could speak briefly about marketing products beyond the boundaries of the countries where you work. Like, how do you kind of keep that supply chain going and really benefit communities and wildlife at a greater scale? So those are two more questions for you.
Okay, I'll start with the last one since it's in my head. That's a great question. Thanks, Natalie. So from the beginning, we decided that, and part of that certification process of looking at the enabling conditions, part of that is looking at the business fundamentals and what makes sense for that product. So for sure, there are some products that don't make sense to export. They should be a local, regional, or national product because it's too complicated or expensive to export them, and we don't want to be contributing to climate change by shipping things around the world that shouldn't be shipped around the world. And we had some important lessons early on about that. Part of our mission has been to shorten the learning curve for each conservation enterprise so that it didn't take a decade for each one to come on board. So, for example, I think some of you may be familiar with one of our earliest enterprises, which was elephant pepper. Loki Osborne and WCS, and that was originally shipped in glass containers, which they realized was too heavy. And so they had to sort of go back, and here you have some PhD elephant researchers trying to figure out how to export and market fancy foods. So that's a huge challenge, and they were one of our inspirations for creating Wildlife Friendly, but we wanted to be able to help the next elephant pepper sort of shorten that learning curve and be able to share some of those lessons early on. So if a product doesn't make sense to export, that's fine. That's not a requirement for us. The ones that can be exported and are sort of more commodity type products, which I think the tea, the coffee, and some of these fibers are, then, it makes sense. By definition, some of these need to stay small. Also, we don't want them at scale. But the ones that are already at scale, if we can mitigate the damage to habitat and wildlife, then that's our work. As far as the species question, so we have those I think there's 5 of them, species specific projects. Those are actually a newer venture for us. We have a more general global way of operating, which most of our enterprises are actually under. And we require the presence of key species, and we feature a variety of those species. If you go to our website, wildlifefriendly.org, and look down at the very bottom, you'll see a scrolling banner that has all of our logos. So we require what we call a key species to be present at the site, but that species, it's used in branding, but that species is really a representative of that habitat. So they're linked. We don't see them as separate. By protecting those species, we're protecting habitat, and that's we don't see them as separate issues. I hope that answers that question.
I think it does. And I think the question that we talked about, I know was going to be asked, and it is being asked. I mean, Luis in El Salvador is asking, do you have evidence of positive conservation outcomes for any particular species? I know you had talked about how that monitoring is not really your responsibility, that's part of what the local organization on the ground does. But do you have any kind of, even if it's anecdotal, able to?
Yeah. So by working, one of the things that we've decided as an organization, because we are so small and because the work we're doing is so huge, that we don't have the resources and capacity to measure outcomes, and it's really outside of our mission. But that's another great reason for working with these local NGOs and researchers who, when they have the funding and the resources and the time, are doing this work. And so we have, I don't want to talk about things I probably shouldn't talk about publicly yet, but for some of our projects, there are scientists that are looking at the standards and feeding that data into population models to see what the change in mortality is going to be for that species in question. So when I do have permission to share that work, I certainly will. It's really exciting for us to think about linking, the standards started with science and got translated into standards, but to then be able to run a model and see, okay, if you had X amount of acreage under the management scenario that's being laid out by these standards, what does that mean on the ground for this species in question? So I would say stay tuned. That's work in process. Again, it's not work that we're doing directly, but our partners are doing it.
I think my last question for you, Julie, was to really just get your advice and for you to give us your opinion as, as a small NGO kind of making that bridge between communities and the private sector. What do you want us to know about how we can help you?
Wow. Yeah, well, I guess, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. And I guess this is a good chance to make a link back to our beginning, because USAID really helped launch us. I'm not sure how many are aware of that in your institutional history, but one of our first grants, we weren't one of the primary partners, but we were part of the grant, was TransLinks, and we had early USAID cheerleaders in the form of Mike Colby and Diane Russell, who were very supportive of what we were doing, and we're so grateful for that early support. So being able to be here today and present back to you all, we're a little over a decade old, really brings things full circle to us. So I think you helped bring us into existence to begin with. So for that, I wanted to say take this opportunity to make sure to say thank you. And I hope we'll have, we're small, so we don't qualify for a lot of, to be the primary partner in a lot of your grants, but we're hoping in future we can do that again, because I think, our approach, it's just so nice to see that you have learning groups on these two topics that we feel are the foundation upon which we were built. So I hope we can continue to build links between the people listening today and others at USAID. We're open to all suggestions and brainstorming and creative ideas for how we can assist and continue to build the partnership that started over 10 years ago. And I guess I also just wanted to say, when we first started this, we had a meeting at White Oak Conservation Center, which some of you may have had the pleasure of visiting, over a decade ago in 2007. And we had a branding professional there, a global guy from a global branding firm who's on our board now. And he told me at that time that it takes 10 years of hard work to build a brand and get consumer visibility. And at the time, it went in one ear and out the other, but 12 years later, I'm realizing it's really true. And we've learned so much. We've made a lot of mistakes. But I think we're really at the cusp now of being able to break through and have consumer visibility. We're certainly not a household word yet, but it's building. Momentum and excitement is building. So we're thrilled for that. We're thrilled for the early support from USAID and for this opportunity to be able to speak to you. And I hope we can continue to have more conversations like this to build on this, now that hopefully everybody has a little bit better understanding about what we do, because I know sometimes it's not always easy to understand from websites what the actual work is, but I hope that's become more clear from today.
No, thanks, Julie. I worked on the very end of TransLinks and actually managed the evaluation of TransLinks, and I was really reminded how impact takes a long time, often after the end of an award, because I know that Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network did not really come out strongly in that evaluation as having the impact on your organization, as you mentioned today. And the comment you made about 10 years to build a brand really resonates with me. And I hope the participants who took our counter wildlife trafficking training recently appreciate the kind of consumer studies that you did and that you shared with us at the end about, how do you really message for that aspirational consumer. We did have a pod here with links so that folks, if you wanted to explore Julie's website or any of those materials, you can click on those links. We would appreciate it if you would answer our last two poll questions. And I think we ended up being split there for people who had visited our learning group sites and those who hadn't. This is a screenshot of those two learning group sites where this webinar recording will be posted, and where you can also find other webinar recordings, as well as all of the materials for both learning groups that we've presented or that we've worked on through our learning agendas. So if you could please take this poll around, were the concepts in the webinar that we talked about today with Julie, do you think you'll be able to apply them in your programming? And then we would really love to hear from you. You are our target audience. You are our participants. We would like to know what other kind of content would you like, whether you would like to share results from one of your own activities, or if there's a speaker out there that you would really like us to reach out to. I really wanted to thank Natalie daily, as well as she was our connection to Julie, who really, I can't, again, thank you enough, Julie, for this great engaging presentation that was directly relevant to our learning questions. And I hope that we'll be able to stay in touch. I know several people on the webinar today will probably be reaching out to you. I think you had a slide there with your email. If anybody needs to know how to reach Julie, please just shoot me an email and I will be happy to connect you. There we go. There's Julie's email there with some nice critters. My sister actually has one of those dogs, so they are very friendly. I can attest to that. Thanks again to our participants for joining us. We're all, facing the reality of telework, and so I was very glad that we had the great participants that we had today. Any other questions, comments from the chat box? And without that, I think we will sign off. Thank you again, Julie. If there was a way to do remote clapping, I think you would be getting a lot.
I just wanted to say thank you to Natalie as well, and thank you so much for the weeks of preparation to get ready for this. It was really rewarding for me, and I'm going to be sharing with my board today how exciting it was, because many of them were involved in TransLink. So it's been a long journey, and it's really nice to have this, like I said, bring it full circle.
Thanks again, and please, we'll keep the polling questions open for just a bit. If you guys want to take some time to fill out the poll question around other topics, you still have time to do that. Thanks again, Julie.
Thank you, everybody.